most people travel to Cuba, they go for like the dancing, they go for the beaches. It just seems really selfish because there's a whole other side to visiting Cuba that doesn't get seen, doesn't get learned, doesn't get known. And it's just there. There's a whole reality. And to miss that, I feel like it's just wrong. So let's talk about Cuba. If you've looked in the recent headlines, typed in the word Cuba, you might find many articles showing that there are some protests, anti-government protests. This is a very historic moment for Cuba, for Cuban people for that matter. Now, mind you, I'm not in Cuba, I'm not speaking on behalf of the situation. I don't usually like to dabble into politics because that's not what my channel is about. It's about my voyages. But within those voyages, I do encounter a lot of great experiences directly with people. And for those who follow my channel, I visited Cuba in 2015, and one of the greatest privileges I had was connecting with many Cuban people. And in those experiences, I learned about the dark living conditions that everyday Cuban people face in Cuba. I made a Reels and TikTok post about my amazing time in Cuba back in 2015, and some of what I found out is allowing me to be in front of the camera today. Many Cubans, to no surprise, don't have a voice. So me being here right now is an extension of that voice. Or at least I hope so. I spent 2 full weeks in Cuba, so I can't sit here and say this is exactly what's going on. But I will share with you 7 eye-opening things that I noticed in Cuba, either by simply observation or through the many incredible interactions I had with Cuban people. Cuba, to no surprise, is a socialist country, which means that people are not making money like they would be here in the States. During my time in Cuba, one of the things I asked was, what is the salary of the average person? What I found out was just, wow.
Un cirujano quinto pero, por ejemplo, en Cuba, gana al mes solo 40 cuc, que son 1,000 pesos cubanos. Cuando este par de zapatos que tengo yo, que no sirve para nada, esto no sirve, cuestan 20. O sea que si yo soy médico profesional, cirujano, se me acabó el money del mes. Son 40 cuc al mes. 1,000 pesos cubanos, que no compras nada. Un pollo en Cuba vale 7 cuc, casi 200 pesos moneda nacional. Quiere decir que con 4 pollos, 4 chicken, 20 cuc al mes, que son 500. Esta camisa vale 20. Si mi amigo no me la trae de afuera, no puedo comprarla porque si compro la camisa no puedo comer. En Cuba hay muchos problemas con el salario.
The highest paid salary is anywhere from $25, $30, $40, but that is if you're a doctor. But the average person apparently makes about $20 to $25 a month. A month. US dollars a month to live. This is why I saw on the streets people had shoes on with holes in them. One of my hosts was pregnant and her clothes did not fit. This is why many locals will approach tourists respectfully and kindly to try to get business from them. There's a genuinity, but people in Cuba need money. They barely have any to get by. When you visit Cuba as a tourist, it's no surprise you have a lot of you're catered to. You're tourists. You get some luxuries like some food. You have certain places that will serve you like a first world country, let's just say. And one of the things I had the opportunity to see was we hired 2 guys to drive us back from Viñales to Havana. And these guys, they needed to make a stop off for some food. I guess they went much of the day without food. They were starving. They asked us if it was okay. Me and my mom were like, yeah, don't worry about it. We're cool. We're hanging. They stopped at this marketplace somewhere on the outskirts of Havana, and I was thirsty. I wanted to get out and get a bottle of water. But turns out that the cab drivers didn't really appreciate that. Not in a bad way, but they didn't want to be looked upon as taking tourists to this place. And I felt bad, I apologized, but I was really thirsty. But what I did notice was a rundown market with food vendors selling food, different sandwiches, but it wasn't clean. The food was sitting out in the open. You had flies buzzing around. It just didn't look very sanitary. And when we were there, I don't think we were meant to be. There's just those little things that we probably shouldn't have seen, but I did. But I'm glad I did because it allows me to now share it. Casas particulares are like the Airbnbs of Cuba. where you have these very unique places to stay, and you get to stay with them and have a unique experience. One misconception tourists have is that, oh, we're gonna stay in a casa and we're gonna support local, we're gonna take care of them. That is true, kinda, or maybe mostly kinda. It doesn't make any sense. One thing I noticed in staying in just about 8 to 9 casas in my entire trip in Cuba is that there was a person that came with a book or a bag that looked like a laptop bag, pull out some paperwork, sit the host down, and they would go over numbers. These private Airbnbs, you call them, are not exactly private. The government sends officials to these casas to collect information and I guess what I would presume, money. Wi-Fi was just recently introduced. Like, I went to Cuba in October, and it was just that past January, different park squares or different establishments across the country were set up with these Wi-Fi hotspots. For tourists, you would go into like this agency and buy a card, different denominations, and you would have a set amount of Wi-Fi memory, and once you're up, then you go buy another card. Around Cuba, I found that it seemed like there would be like this one person with a laptop who would hack in and get the Wi-Fi for free. What seemed like half of the community tethering to this new Wi-Fi hotspot and connecting to Wi-Fi, using what they can to connect with the outside world, whether it's information or talking to their family. I just thought it was interesting to see, but I was also happy for them. The biggest, most obvious observation in any time you visit Cuba, or even just simply doing research, is that there is a massive segregation from a tourist to a local. And that is really defined in the currency, or two, I should say. There is the CUC, which is the peso convertible, the tourist currency, which is pegged exactly to the US dollar. And then there's the CUP, the CUP, actual Cuban peso. The value of it is far less than the CUC. But as I mentioned before, it's like there are establishments that are meant for tourists, and then there are many others that are not meant for tourists. I don't know, it's like most people travel to Cuba, go for the beaches. It just seems really selfish because there's a whole other side to visiting Cuba that doesn't get seen, doesn't get learned, doesn't get known, and it's just there. There's a whole reality, and to miss that, I feel like that it's just wrong. Tourism was set up in a way to bring in revenue for solely the government. I mean, like anything else, it's really not meant for the people. It's meant for the government. If there are any other realities to be learned of, this is the biggest one. If you go to Cuba and you hire Via Azul to get around the country, you probably won't notice this much. But if you do hire a taxi to get from different places around the island, you'll find that there are a lot of people standing on the side of the road or the highway. And what you would consider hitchhiking, this is considered to many locals a way of getting around. I found a couple times when I had to hire a car to get from town to town that we had stopped to pick up a person or two on the side of the road along the way, and that's just the way it is. Oh, and one thing I neglected to mention is that those beautiful American classics are anything but the original cars from the 1950s. The Cuban people have had to make do with what they had for over 50 years, which means that a lot of the parts of these cars are not original. A beautiful Chevy Bel Air will more than likely have an engine of a Toyota or multiple parts of different engines. In a classic Ford, there was a steering wheel that was part of like a minivan. And another classic, the door handle was a screwdriver. It's honestly remarkable, but the reality is pretty sad. And the last one, it really breaks my heart. You've probably heard stories of people managing to successfully leave Cuba, cross the Florida Strait, and successfully land in Florida to start a new life in America. While there are some family members, I'm not going to speak for all of them, some family members that end up in Miami or different parts of the States, they remain in contact with their families in the motherland, Cuba. I did find in my travels across Cuba different hosts I stayed with, different people I met in the street. There were a lot of situations where a cousin, a daughter, a son, a close relative ended up in the United States, and they hadn't heard from in years. And the sad part about it is not the disconnection, the loss of communication of that family member, but the hardest part, and I think I cried one time, was that the Cubans in Cuba who have lost connection with these relatives are still waiting next to the phone, like, they'll call any second now, they're probably busy. And come to find out, in some scenarios, it's not the case. They're living the life in America and they completely forgot about their family in the motherland, Cuba. I'm not one to judge on how a destination, a city, a way of life, or an entire country has to live. That's not my place. When I travel, I take it in for what it is, and I appreciate and love it, its people, its way of life, its culture for what it is. But the reality is simple. Cuban people in Cuba, they're suffering. It was just today I found out that something had happened to the effect of the electricity was cut off, the government cut off cellular activity to suppress, I guess, the movement. I'm not exactly sure the detail. It honestly doesn't surprise me. I just know that in a normal day in Cuba, back in 2015, where there were no protests, nothing like that going on, that people struggle to live. The liberties that people have in Cuba are very limited, and the government does have a upper hand in just about everything that everyday people do. So to conclude this video, I'm just gonna say that I don't know what the results of what's going on in Cuba is going to be, but I did make mention in my video in 2015 when I shared some of my observations that I don't know when things are gonna change for Cuban people that want liberties to be had in a democracy. I don't know when that's gonna happen. It could be a year, a couple of years. Whenever the case, it's gonna happen. With these anti-government protests, the time could be now. And if it's not, I would say that the Cuban people are one step ahead to achieving those liberties. For people like me who love and care about Cuban people's livelihoods and well-being, the genuine people that I met there, I and hopefully other people who can sit behind a camera like this, sit behind a desk and write a blog, can do their part to extend the voices of Cuban people.